The air in the vault was thick with the ghosts of forgotten promises, a century of dust motes dancing in the beam of Jenna's flashlight. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the dead silence. Before her lay not treasure chests of gold, but something far more potent, canvas sacks slumped like sleeping giants, each one stamped with the seal of a bank that had vanished with the gold rush. She didn't know yet that these bags held $5.9 million. She didn't know this discovery would rewrite the history of a town. And she certainly didn't know that her $17 gamble was about to change her life forever. But as she reached out a trembling hand, one question echoed in the stillness. Could a forgotten injustice finally be made right? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Jenna Lawson moved through her life with the quiet precision of someone trying not to knock anything over. At 32, she was a paralegal, a title that sounded more impressive than it felt. It paid just enough to keep her and her son, Leo, in a cramped two-bedroom apartment where the scent of their neighbor's cooking was a permanent resident and the sirens of the city were their nightly lullaby. She was sharp, with a mind that could untangle legal jargon like a seasoned fisherman sorting his nets, but weariness had settled deep into her bones, a constant low-grade fever of exhaustion. Her days were a blur of drafting documents, managing case files, and placating impatient lawyers, all while the mountain of her own personal debt grew, an unmovable, shadowy peak on the horizon of her future. Law school, the dream she had polished and held close since she was a girl, was now a distant, hazy shoreline, receding with every bill that arrived in the mail. Her evenings were for Leo. He was 10, a bright, boundless spark of energy and curiosity, wrapped in a whirlwind of perpetually untied shoelaces and smudged glasses. He was the anchor and the sail of her life, the reason for the grind and the reason it was all worth it. Tonight, he was spread out on the living room floor, surrounded by books from the library, his brow furrowed in concentration. A detailed drawing of a haunted house was taking shape under his colored pencils. "Mom, did you know some ghost towns have real ghosts?" he asked, not looking up from his work. His voice was filled with the earnest gravity only a 10-year-old can muster when discussing the paranormal. Jenna looked up from the stack of bills on the small dining table, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. The red ink on the final notice for the electricity bill seemed to glare at her. "I'm more worried about the real bills, sweetie," she said, her voice softer than she felt. "But who knows? Maybe we'll find a friendly one who knows where some treasure is buried." She tried to make it a joke, but the words felt heavy in her mouth. The truth was, she was drowning, and the shore felt miles away. Leo, oblivious to the undertow of her anxiety, just nodded seriously. A ghost with treasure. That would be cool. Later that night, long after Leo was asleep and the apartment was finally quiet, Jenna sat in the blue glow of her laptop screen. This was her ritual, a nightly descent into the digital rabbit hole of county websites, foreclosure listings, and obscure government auctions. It was a habit born from her job, a relentless search for a loophole, a forgotten asset, a clerical error that might, just might, offer a way out. She scrolled through pages of seized vehicles and office furniture, her eyes gritty with fatigue. It was a fool's errand. She knew, a form of magical thinking, but it was better than staring at the ceiling and letting the panic win. Her cursor hovered over a link on the far corner of the Sterling County Surplus property page. The text was small, almost an afterthought, "Auction of defunct township assets." Intrigued, she clicked. The page was archaic, a relic from the early 2000s with basic HTML and no images. It listed a handful of items, mostly road signs and a rusted snowplow. And then she saw it. Lot 34. Description: the old Aurelia County Courthouse. A single, formidable-sounding property nestled among the forgotten junk of a dead town. The minimum bid was $15. A non-refundable filing fee of $2 was required. $17 total. It was absurd. A courthouse for the price of a pizza. A stone building, a piece of history, listed with less fanfare than a used desk chair. Aurelia. The name rang a distant bell. A ghost town from a history lesson, a place that had boomed and busted with the gold rush over a century ago. No one had lived there for decades. The property was worthless, a tax liability, a ruin. And yet, Jenna stared at the screen, her heart starting to beat a little faster. It felt like a sign, a glitch in the matrix of her monotonous, debt-ridden life. The idea was insane, a reckless, nonsensical impulse. But it was also the only thing that had felt like a real choice in years. It was a tangible piece of the world she so desperately wanted to join, a world of law and justice, even if it was a fossil of that world. In the quiet desperation of that late hour, she could almost picture it. A life away from the city, a project she and Leo could pour themselves into, a home they could build from the bones of history. It was a fantasy, woven from exhaustion and the faint, flickering hope that refused to be extinguished. Her fingers trembled as she typed in her information. She entered her bid, $17. She clicked, submit. A wave of pure panic washed over her, cold and sharp. What had she done? She'd just thrown away $17. Money she needed for groceries, for gas, for the ever-present pile of bills. But then, just as quickly, a strange and profound sense of calm settled over her. She had made a move. It might be a disastrous one, but it was hers. She had either bought a future or thrown $17 into the wind. Either way, she had done something. The next morning, she told Leo, framing it not as a desperate gamble but as their next great adventure. "I bought us a castle, kiddo," she'd said, her voice bright with forced cheerfulness. A real old-timey courthouse. In a ghost town. Leo's eyes had widened, his imagination instantly catching fire. A castle. A ghost town. It was better than any storybook. Weeks later, a thick manila envelope arrived. Inside, nestled in a sheaf of official-looking papers, was the deed. It was real. Jenna Lawson was now the owner of Lot 34, Aurelia, Sterling County. The following Saturday, they drove. The journey was a slow transformation of the world around them. The concrete and steel of the city gave way to sprawling suburbs, which in turn melted into wide, open farmland. Soon, the green fields turned to gold, and the rolling hills grew more rugged, dotted with scrub brush and weathered rock formations. The air itself seemed to change, losing the city's hazy, chemical tang and taking on the clean, dry scent of dust and wild sage. They followed a winding state highway until a small, faded sign directed them onto a cracked asphalt road. Aurelia, it read, the letters peeling. The road soon dissolved into gravel, and the car kicked up a plume of dust behind them. Then they saw it. The town, or what was left of it, was a collection of weathered skeletons. A general store with a collapsed porch roof, a saloon with swinging doors frozen at a crooked angle, a handful of houses that were little more than foundations and splintered frames. It was a silent, lonely place, haunted by the ghosts of ambition and failure. And then, standing apart from the rest, on a slight rise overlooking the skeletal remains of the town, was the courthouse. It was a formidable two-story structure, built from large, rough-hewn blocks of granite. It was imposing, even in its state of decay, with a stern, unyielding presence. Tall, arched windows, now opaque with grime, stared out like clouded eyes. To one side, a massive oak tree stood, its branches bare and twisted, a stark silhouette against the vast, pale blue sky. But it was the clock tower that drew Jenna's gaze. It rose from the center of the roof, a square turret topped with a small, pointed spire. And on its face, the great, black hands of the clock were frozen. They pointed to exactly 4:12. Jenna shivered, a prickle of unease running down her spine. It was such a specific time, a moment captured and held for eternity. "It's a castle, Mom," Leo whispered from the passenger seat, his face pressed against the window, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on awe. Jenna killed the engine, and the sudden silence was immense, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. She looked at the stone behemoth before them, at the boarded-up windows and the crumbling mortar. "It's a money pit," she muttered to herself. "The the weight of her impulsive decision settling upon her like a physical blow. What have I done? The key was as old as the building, a long piece of ornate brass, heavy in her hand. It slid into the keyhole of the massive oak double doors with a gritty scrape. Jenna put her shoulder into it, turning with all her might. For a long moment, nothing happened. The lock was frozen, a solid chunk of rust and time. She felt a surge of despair, the image of them driving all this way just to be defeated by a locked door flashing in her mind. She tried again, gritting her teeth, pouring every ounce of her frustration and desperate hope into the effort. There was a deep, groaning sound from within the mechanism, a shriek of tortured metal, and then a loud, definitive click that echoed in the stillness. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, opening a dark maw into the building's interior. The air that flowed out was heavy and cool, carrying a scent she couldn't quite place, the smell of old paper and rain. Sunlight, thick with dancing columns of dust, streamed through the tall, grimy arched windows, illuminating a scene from a forgotten time. They were standing in the main courtroom. Rows of simple wooden benches, like pews in a forgotten church, filled the space, each one furred with a thick, uniform layer of gray dust. A fine grit covered every surface, a sandy film that softened every edge and muted every color. At the far end of the room, elevated on a platform, was the judge's bench. It was a massive, imposing piece of furniture, carved from a dark, rich wood that seemed to absorb the light. It commanded the room, a silent, powerful testament to the authority it once represented. Jenna felt a strange mix of emotions wash over her. There was a sense of reverence for the history held within these walls, for the stories and secrets they kept. But there was also an overwhelming dread at the sheer scale of the decay, the monumental task she had taken on for $17. It was magnificent and it was a ruin. Leo, however, felt none of her apprehension. With a whoop of pure joy, he broke away from her side, running down the central aisle, his small feet kicking up clouds of ancient dust. "Echo!" he shouted, and his voice bounced off the high ceilings, clear and bright in the vast, silent space. A small smile touched Jenna's lips as she watched him. Maybe this wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was an adventure after all. She walked slowly towards the front of the courtroom, her own footsteps seeming impossibly loud. She climbed the 2 steps to the platform and walked behind the judge's bench, running her hand along the smooth, cool wood. Felt solid, real. A strange sense of purpose began to bloom in her chest, pushing back the edges of her anxiety. Her fingers traced the intricate floral carvings on the paneled wall behind the bench. The craftsmanship was beautiful, the work of a master artisan. As her hand moved across the wood, she noticed something odd. A thin, vertical line that broke the pattern of the carving. It wasn't a crack. It was a seam too perfect, too straight. She looked closer. Along this almost invisible edge, the paneling was clean, while every other surface, every nook and cranny, was covered in a fine layer of dust. This single line was bare, as if it had been disturbed more recently than a century ago. Her heart gave a little flutter. With a sense of mounting excitement, she pressed her fingers against the section of paneling. It didn't move. She pushed harder, leaning her weight into it. There was a soft, satisfying click, and a narrow, concealed door swung silently inward, revealing a dark, cramped space beyond. Jenna and Leo peered into the abyss. The air that greeted them was a physical presence, a wall of stillness thick with the scent of dry rot and forgotten time. It was a small, windowless room, a secret pocket carved out of the courthouse's heart. A simple wooden desk, its surface warped and split, sat against one wall, a single skeletal chair beside it, its cane seat having long ago surrendered to gravity and decay. Along the other wall, crude wooden shelves sagged under the weight of dozens of leather-bound ledgers, their spines coated in a pale, fuzzy mold that seemed to breathe in the stagnant air. Dust wasn't just a layer here. It was an element, a soft, gray soil from which nothing would ever grow. But it was the object against the far wall that seized Jenna's attention, pulling the air from her lungs. It was a safe, a massive, black, cast-iron behemoth, standing nearly 4 feet high. Faded, hand-painted scrollwork, once likely of vibrant gold and red, curled across its heavy door like the ghosts of climbing roses. It was a relic from another age, a testament to a time when security was measured in sheer, unmovable weight. The focal point was a heavy brass wheel in the center of the door, the combination dial, its surface tarnished with a greenish patina. It looked less like a lock and more like the helm of a sunken ship. A jolt of pure, unadulterated hope shot through Jenna, so potent it made her dizzy. This was it. This had to be it. The secret behind the secret door. The answer to a question she hadn't even known how to ask. She stepped into the cramped space, her sneakers silent on the dusty floorboards. Leo followed, his eyes wide as dinner plates. "Is the treasure in there?" he whispered, his voice hushed with the same reverence he'd used for the courthouse itself. "I don't know, Leo," Jenna breathed, her own voice tight with a mixture of hope and fear. She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a second before making contact with the cold, rough iron of the safe's door. Felt ancient, immovable. She gripped the heavy, ornate handle, a thick bar of scrolled iron, and pulled. Nothing. It was locked solid, as unyielding as the granite walls of the building. Of course it was. Her gaze shifted to the brass combination wheel. This was the key. She wrapped her hands around it, the metal cool and gritty beneath her palms, and tried to turn it. It wouldn't budge. Not a millimeter. It was completely seized, frozen fast by a century of rust and neglect. She repositioned her grip, planting her feet, and threw her entire body weight into the effort. A low grunt escaped her lips. The wheel remained stubbornly, infuriatingly still. Frustration, sharp and bitter, rose in her throat, chasing away the brief, sweet taste of hope. It was a literal dead end. A 4-foot-tall, 1-ton iron symbol of her life, a locked box of possibilities with a mechanism that had rusted shut. She could see the future, almost touch it, but she couldn't make the damn wheel turn. She wanted to scream, to kick the stupid, silent thing, to pound her fists against its indifferent iron face. "It could just be full of old papers," she said, her voice flat as she straightened up, brushing dust from her jeans. She was talking more to herself than to Leo, trying to manage her own plummeting expectations. Or spiders. Probably lots of spiders. Leo, undeterred, ran a finger over the faded painted flowers. "Or gold," he countered, his belief absolute. "Like in the movies. You just have to figure out the combination." Jenna let out a short, humorless laugh. "Right, the combination. I'll just check under the welcome mat." She stepped back, the small room suddenly feeling suffocating. The safe loomed in the darkness, a silent challenge, its secrets locked away as securely as the day they were hidden. The frustration was a physical thing, a coiling knot in her stomach. She had to get out of this tiny, musty tomb. She needed air. She needed a distraction. Her eyes fell on the shelves of decaying ledgers. Documents. Something she understood. "Okay, Mr. Explorer," she said, forcing a brighter tone for Leo's sake. "While I try to figure out how to open a 100-year-old safe, why don't we see what other secrets this place has?" It was a monumental task, cleaning a century of neglect, but it was better than staring at the immovable safe. She decided to start there, in the clerk's room and the adjacent judge's chambers, which were just as dusty but more spacious, with a large mahogany desk and tall, empty bookshelves. She carefully carried a few of the least moldy-looking ledgers from the hidden room out into the main courtroom, where the light was better and the air felt cleaner. The pages were brittle, the color of old ivory, and they crackled in protest as she opened them. The ink was a faded brown, the handwriting a spidery, elegant script that was difficult to decipher. She and Leo sat on the floor of the great, empty courtroom, the columns of sunlight illuminating the dust they stirred up. Leo, armed with a soft paintbrush from his art kit, was meticulously cleaning the cover of one of the smaller books, treating it like a priceless artifact. Jenna, with her paralegal's practiced eye, began to scan the pages of a large docket book dated 1892. The ledgers told the story of Aurelia, They were a chronicle of a town in the grip of gold fever. The pages were filled with the mundane and the dramatic, a litany of human ambition and folly. There were endless mining claim disputes, the legal battles for the rights to pull wealth from the surrounding hills. There were charges of theft, mostly for tools, horses, or small pouches of gold dust. There were fines for public intoxication, for brawling in the saloon, for licentious behavior. It was a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the life of a frontier town, and Jenna found herself captivated. She could almost hear the voices, see the faces of the people whose lives were recorded in this faded ink, the hopeful prospectors, the weary merchants, the stern, unseen judge who presided over it all. She read aloud some of the more colorful entries to Leo, who listened with rapt attention. "The People versus Silas Croft," she read, her finger tracing the delicate script. "Charged with the theft of 1 mule, name of Beatrice. Fined $20 and sentenced to 10 days in the county jail." $20 was a lot back then, right? Leo asked, looking up from his careful brushing. Jenna nodded, a small frown creasing her brow. "A lot. A man might have to work for a month to earn that." She turned the page. Another case, a dispute over a water right. The losing party was fined $30. A few pages later, a man charged with cheating at cards was fined $50. A pattern began to emerge from the lists of names and numbers, a subtle but persistent anomaly that snagged at the edge of her professional instincts. The fines were high, unusually, almost predatorily high for the era and the infractions. Back in the city, she'd spent years reviewing legal billing, spotting padded hours and inflated expenses. She knew the look of a system that was being milked. This felt like that. She picked up another ledger, this one labeled County Deposits, 1891 to 1894. It wasn't a court docket. It was a financial record, and the entries were different. The spidery script listed names, dates, and amounts, but the descriptions were what made Jenna sit up straighter. Land claim deposit, surety bond, mining operation, business license escrow. These weren't fines. This was money being held by the court in trust. Prospectors, it seemed, had to put down a significant deposit to stake a claim, a bond to ensure they would work the land and not just sit on it. New businesses had to post bonds. The sums were substantial, ranging from $100 to, in one case, several $1,000s from a large mining syndicate. Page after page, the numbers grew. It was a river of money, flowing into the coffers of the Aurelia County Courthouse. For each entry, there was a neat, methodical notation of the deposit. But as she flipped towards the end of the book, looking for records of the money being returned, she found nothing. No withdrawals, no returned bonds, no closed-out accounts, just deposits, a steady, one-way flow of cash. "What is it, Mom?" Leo asked, sensing her change in mood. "It's a lot of money," Jenna said slowly, her mind racing. "People were giving the court money to hold for them, but I don't see where they ever got it back." She worked for hours, the afternoon sun slanting lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. She cross-referenced the docket books with the deposit ledger. A clear and disturbing picture began to form. A miner would be brought up on a trumped-up charge, perhaps for being drunk or causing a minor disturbance. The judge would levy an exorbitant fine. Unable to pay, the miner would forfeit his claim deposit, which the court would then seize. Or a business owner would get into a dispute, and the judge would find a reason to revoke their license and keep the bond they had posted. It was a sophisticated, systematic scheme, all cloaked in the legitimacy of the law. The courthouse wasn't just a seat of justice, it was a machine for separating people from their money. The name that appeared at the bottom of every page, the signature on every ruling, was Judge Alistair Blackwood. His name was a constant, a dark thread woven through the fabric of every transaction. He was the architect of this whole enterprise. Jenna felt a chill crawl up her spine. She was sitting in his courtroom, the room where he had wielded his power, his presence almost palpable in the heavy silence. She imagined him sitting on that imposing bench, his face stern and unreadable, as he methodically stripped hopeful men of their dreams. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when she found a thin volume tucked away at the back of the judge's private desk. It wasn't a public record. It was a private journal. The entries were sparse, written in the same elegant hand, but the tone was different. It was the record of an audit. A state examiner had come to Aurelia in the summer of 1895. Blackwood wrote of impertinent questions and unwarranted scrutiny. The final entry in the journal was dated October 12, 1895. The examiner grows too bold, Blackwood had written, the script slightly more hurried than in previous entries. He speaks of discrepancies of funds unaccounted for. A full audit of the vault is scheduled for the 16th. Measures must be taken. The integrity of this institution must be preserved at all costs. There were no more entries. Jenna's blood ran cold. An audit, a threat of exposure, and then nothing. She looked up at the clock tower, visible through the tall, grimy window. The hands were still frozen at 4:12. It was a time, she now realized, not a random moment of mechanical failure. It was a timestamp, a marker for when everything stopped. She imagined the panic that must have gripped Judge Blackwood. The state was closing in. His lucrative scheme was about to be exposed. He had to hide the money, all of it, the accumulated wealth from years of predatory fines and seized deposits. He would have needed to move it somewhere no one would ever think to look, somewhere it could wait until the heat was off. Her eyes were drawn back to the dark, narrow opening behind the judge's bench. The hidden clerk's room, and inside it the silent, waiting safe. It wasn't just a safe. It was a vault, a hiding place. And Judge Blackwood had hidden the evidence of his crimes, the money itself, inside it, slammed the door, and then what? Vanished? Died? Whatever had happened. The clock had stopped, the town had died, and the secret had remained, locked away in iron and time. The money in that safe didn't belong to the court. It belonged to the people Blackwood had stolen it from, the miners and the merchants, the families who had come to Aurelia with hope in their hearts and left with nothing. A new feeling began to replace her frustration, a slow-burning sense of righteous anger. This wasn't just about a potential windfall for her and Leo anymore. This was about justice, a century late, but justice all the same. The weight of her own debts, the anxieties that kept her awake at night, seemed to shrink in the face of this vast, historical injustice. She looked at Leo, who had fallen asleep, his head pillowed on a dusty law book, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She was doing this for him, for their future. But now, she was also doing it for the ghosts of Aurelia. She stood up, her body stiff from sitting on the hard floor for hours. She walked back to the hidden room and stood before the safe, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. It no longer looked like an obstacle. It looked like a responsibility. The faded scrollwork seemed to whisper stories of the people whose money was locked inside. The seized brass wheel was not just a mechanical problem. It was a seal on a century-old crime. Her frustration hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. It was no longer the helpless anger of a victim of circumstance, but the focused determination of someone with a purpose. She didn't know how, but she was going to get that door open. She owed it to the ghosts. She owed it to herself. The question was no longer what was inside, but what she would do when she found it. The determination settled in Jenna's bones, a cold, hard certainty that displaced the frantic, helpless anger. Standing in the oppressive silence of the hidden room, the flashlight beams centered on the impassive face of the safe. She understood that her life had irrevocably split into two distinct eras, before the safe and after. This was no longer a desperate gamble, a lottery ticket she had scratched off in the dark. This was a responsibility. The money locked inside, if her theory was correct, was not a treasure to be found, but a crime to be unearthed. It was evidence, and evidence had to be handled with care. Her paralegal training, a set of instincts honed by years of navigating legal minefields, took over. She couldn't just smash it open. She couldn't even hire a random person to drill it. Every step she took from this moment forward had to be documented, witnessed, and above reproach. If she opened it alone and found what she suspected, she would be a thief. If she opened it with the wrong person, she could be an accomplice. She needed a professional, someone bonded and insured, someone whose testimony would be unimpeachable. And she needed to record everything. The thought came to her with the force of a revelation, a simple, brilliant solution. She would film it, every second of it, from the locksmith's arrival to the moment the door swung open. A silent, digital witness that could not be questioned. She backed out of the cramped room, leaving the safe to its dark vigil. In the main courtroom, the last of the afternoon light was painting the dusty air in shades of gold and rose. Leo was still asleep, his face peaceful. His small hand curled around a dusty copy of Black's Law Dictionary he'd adopted as a pillow. A fierce, protective love swelled in her chest. This was for him, for a future free from the suffocating weight of debt, for a life where his curiosity and brilliance would have room to grow, unburdened by her struggles. But it was for the ghosts too, for Silas Croft, who lost his mule and his dignity, for the countless unnamed prospectors and merchants whose hopes were ground into dust by Judge Blackwood's greed. She was their unlikely, accidental executor, and she would not fail them. The drive back to the city was a blur. The contrast between the vast, silent emptiness of Aurelia and the noisy, crowded reality of her apartment had never been more jarring. The courthouse felt more like home now than this cramped box in the sky. That night, after Leo was in bed, she sat down at her laptop, but not for her usual desperate scroll through auction sites. Her search was targeted, professional. She typed in bonded locksmith Sterling County, then refined it to safe technician, and finally, vintage safe specialist. The results were a mix of flashy, modern companies with slick websites and 5-star reviews that felt suspiciously generic. They promised 24/7 service and showed stock photos of smiling men with shiny new tools. Jenna dismissed them all. She was looking for the opposite of that. She was looking for someone who had been doing this long enough to respect the history locked in that iron box. Someone whose reputation was built on decades of trust, not on search engine optimization. She found him on the third page of her search results. The website was a simple, one-page affair, a digital fossil from the late 1990s. Arthur Finch, security technician. The heading read in plain black text. Bonded and insured. Safes, vaults, and locks. Serving Sterling County and surrounding areas since 1978. There was no picture, no list of services, just a name and a landline telephone number. It was perfect. He was perfect. Jenna stared at the number for a full 10 minutes, her stomach churning. She rehearsed the conversation in her head, trying to strike the right balance of professional detachment and urgent need. She couldn't sound like a treasure hunter. She had to sound like a responsible property owner dealing with a logistical problem. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her cell phone and dialed. An older man's voice, calm and gravelly, answered on the second ring. Finch. Hello. My name is Jenna Lawson, she began, her voice steadier than she expected. I'm calling about a service for a safe. What kind of safe? He asked, his tone all business. It's old. Very old. It's a cast iron model. I believe it's a Victor Safe and Lock Company piece from the 1890s. It's located in a commercial property I recently acquired. There was a pause on the other end of the line. A Victor, you say? Don't see many of those anymore. Where's the property? This was the tricky part. It's the old county courthouse in Aurelia. Another longer pause. Jenna could hear the faint sound of a television in the background. Aurelia, he finally said, the name tasting of disbelief. There's nothing out there but dust and rattlesnakes. I didn't think anyone even owned that courthouse. The county auctioned it as surplus property, Jenna explained, keeping her tone even. I'm the new owner. The safe is in a small, sealed room behind the judge's bench. The combination dial is completely seized. I believe it may contain historical county records, and I need it opened with as little damage as possible, by a bonded professional. She emphasized the last words, hoping he would understand the implication. This wasn't a casual request. Historical records, Arthur repeated, a note of dry amusement in his voice. That's usually what people say when they think there's money inside. Jenna's heart skipped a beat. I understand the skepticism, she said carefully. But this is a former public building, and the safe is likely court property. That's why I need everything to be official. I need a witness as much as I need a locksmith. I intend to video record the entire process for legal purposes. The amusement in his voice faded, replaced by a grudging respect. Video record it, huh? You're a paralegal or a lawyer, aren't you? Paralegal, Jenna confirmed. Thought so, he grunted. All right, Ms. Lawson, you've got my interest, but it won't be cheap. A trip out to Aurelia plus the time and tools for a vintage Victor drill out, you're looking at a significant expense. My fee would be $1,500, half up front as a deposit. Jenna's stomach clenched. It was more money than she had in her account. It would mean maxing out her last credit card, the one she kept for absolute emergencies. This was an emergency. That's acceptable, she said without a moment's hesitation. When can you be there? They arranged it for the following Saturday. After she hung up, Jenna sat in the dark, the numbers of her credit card glowing on the laptop screen as she paid the deposit. It was the biggest, most terrifying gamble of her life, a leap of faith off a financial cliff. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in control. The week crawled by. Jenna went to work, filed her documents, and smiled at her son, all while a current of high-voltage anticipation hummed just beneath her skin. On Saturday morning, she and Leo drove back out to Aurelia, the mood in the car electric with a shared, unspoken excitement. They arrived an hour before Arthur was due, and Jenna used the time to prepare. She cleared a space in the hidden room, wiping down a small section of the floor. She found a stack of thick, leather-bound books and arranged them on the old desk, creating a makeshift tripod for her phone. At precisely 10 o'clock, the sound of an engine broke the silence. A dusty but immaculately maintained old Ford pickup truck rumbled up the gravel road and parked beside her car. The driver's door opened, and Arthur Finch emerged. He was a man in his late 60s, lean and wiry, with a full head of silver hair and the calm, steady eyes of someone who has spent a lifetime solving intricate problems. He wore simple work pants and a clean, pressed shirt. He moved with a quiet, unhurried confidence. He gave Jenna a curt nod. Ms. Lawson, Arthur Finch. Thank you for coming, Mr. Finch, she said, shaking his firm, calloused hand. He didn't waste time with small talk. His gaze swept over the courthouse, taking in its crumbling grandeur. She's a formidable old building, he said, a note of appreciation in his voice. He followed her inside, carrying a heavy-duty toolbox in each hand as if they weighed nothing. Leo watched him with wide, curious eyes. When Arthur saw the safe, he stopped and let out a low, long whistle. Well now, he murmured, setting his toolboxes down with a soft thud. That's a beauty. He approached it with the reverence of a historian examining a rare artifact, running his weathered hands over the cold iron, inspecting the frozen dial, the hinges, the seams of the door. Victor safe, 1893 model. Double-walled with a manganese steel plate. They don't make them like this anymore. This was top of the line. He turned to Jenna, his expression serious. I can try to manipulate the lock, listen to the tumblers. But with a century of rust and humidity, the odds are less than 1 in 100. The only realistic way in is to drill. I'll make a small, precise hole to scope the lock mechanism and disable it from the inside. It's a surgical procedure, but it will permanently alter the safe. Are you sure you want to proceed? Jenna's resolve was absolute. I'm sure, she said. She walked over to her makeshift tripod, turned on her phone's camera, and pressed the record button. The small red light blinked on, a single unwavering eye. I'm ready. Arthur nodded, seemingly satisfied. He opened his toolboxes, revealing a stunning array of specialized equipment. He selected a heavy-duty, variable-speed drill and a long, wicked-looking drill bit made of a dark, cobalt-colored metal. This might take a while, he said, pulling on a pair of safety glasses. And it's going to be loud. He was right. The moment the tip of the drill bit touched the iron door of the safe, a high-pitched, metallic scream ripped through the silence of the courthouse. It was a sound that set Jenna's teeth on edge, a violent protest from a century of slumber. The noise was deafening in the small room, echoing off the stone walls and vibrating through the floorboards. Leo, who had been watching from the doorway, covered his ears and retreated into the main courtroom, the sound too intense for him. Arthur worked with an artist's focus, his body braced, his hands steady. The drill whined, metal shavings piling up on the floor like gray snow. He was a picture of concentration, his brow furrowed, his entire being focused on the single point where modern technology was at war with antique strength. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, pouring through the grimy windows of the main courtroom. Arthur stopped periodically to let the drill cool, or to change to a fresh, sharper bit. He worked in a pool of focused silence, and Jenna watched, her own silence just as intense. Her heart hammered in her chest, a frantic counter-rhythm to the relentless shriek of the drill. This was it. There was no turning back. The sun was beginning its long, slow descent towards the western hills when the sound changed. The high-pitched scream of the drill suddenly dropped in tone, followed by a soft but distinct metallic thunk from within the safe. Arthur immediately pulled the drill back. The sudden, ringing silence was more shocking than the noise had been. He switched off the drill and set it down carefully. He took a long, thin tool from his box, a flexible borescope with a tiny camera on the end, and fed it into the small, perfectly round hole he had created. He peered into the eyepiece for a long, silent minute, his face a mask of concentration. Jenna held her breath, her muscles so tense they ached. Finally, he straightened up, a thin smile touching his lips. "That should do it," he said, his voice startlingly calm in the quiet room. He put away the scope and picked up a stethoscope, placing the cold metal disc against the safe's door, right next to the handle. He closed his eyes, listening intently. Then, he gripped the heavy iron handle with both hands and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning shudder that seemed to run through the entire building, a sound of metal surrendering to time and force, the massive door swung slowly, heavily open. A wave of cold, dry air washed out of the interior, carrying the scent of old canvas and paper money. Jenna fumbled for her flashlight, her hand shaking, and aimed its beam into the dark cavity. Her breath caught in her throat. There were no neat stacks of gold coins, no glittering jewels, no wooden chests. The reality was far more mundane and infinitely more potent. The interior of the safe was packed to capacity with dozens of drab, olive-colored canvas sacks, stacked one on top of the other like bricks. Each bag was cinched at the top with a thick drawstring, and on the front, stenciled in faded black ink, were the words, Aurelia County Bank and Trust. A small, circular lead seal was crimped over the knot of each drawstring, securing the contents. Jenna reached out a trembling hand and touched one of the bags. It was solid, dense, and filled with what felt like tight, rectangular blocks of paper. Arthur shone his own powerful flashlight over her shoulder, the wide beam illuminating the entire hoard. "Well, I'll be," he said softly, his professional calm finally cracking. "Looks like your historical records are all accounted for, Ms. Lawson." But Jenna knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was not looking at records. She was looking at the stolen hopes and broken dreams of a generation. She was looking at the physical manifestation of Judge Alistair Blackwood's greed. The weight of the discovery, the sheer, tangible reality of it, hit her with the force of a physical blow. A dizzying wave of nausea and triumph, of profound terror and righteous vindication, washed over her. Her gaze flickered to her phone, its small red light still blinking, a single, unwavering witness to a secret 100 years in the keeping. The question was no longer what was inside the safe. She had her answer. The new, terrifying question was, what on earth was she going to do now? The question hung in the silent, dusty air, a tangible thing in the beam of her flashlight. What on earth was she going to do now? For a long moment, Jenna was as frozen as the courthouse clock. Her mind, usually a swift and orderly engine of legal logic, was a chaotic storm of shock and terror. The sheer, physical reality of the sacks, the weight of their contents, was crushing. This wasn't a fantasy anymore. This was a crime scene, and she was standing in the middle of it. Arthur Finch let out another low whistle, his calm finally giving way to undisguised awe. He nudged one of the bags with the toe of his work boot. "Lady," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper, "you have a problem." His words, blunt and practical, were the splash of cold water Jenna needed. He was right. This was a problem, a massive, complicated, $5.9 million problem. And problems, her training screamed at her, had protocols. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the air thick with the scent of century-old money, and forced her mind back into order. "You're my witness, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice tight but steady. She turned the flashlight beam from the hoard to his face, then back to the safe, then to her phone, still recording on its makeshift tripod. "You are a bonded professional who opened this safe at my request. You saw what I saw. You were here when the seal was broken." Arthur nodded slowly, understanding her meaning immediately. "That I am. And for the record, that seal wasn't broken. It groaned, it complained, but it opened. The contents were secure until this very moment." Exactly. Jenna's mind was clearing, the paralegal in her taking control, building a case file in her head. First rule: preserve the scene. "We need to close this door." "It won't lock," Arthur said. "I had to disable the mechanism." "I know, but we need to close it. And the panel." She needed to put the monster back in its cage, at least for now. Together, they pushed the heavy iron door shut. It closed with a deep, final-sounding thud, but Jenna knew it was an illusion of security. Then, they swung the carved wooden panel back into place, and the hidden room vanished once more, leaving only the faintest, dust-free seam as evidence of its existence. Felt like burying a body. She walked back to her phone and stopped the recording, saving the file with a trembling finger. It was the most important document she had ever created. In the main courtroom, Leo was awake, blinking in the dim light, drawn by the sudden silence. "Did you get it open?" he asked, his voice sleepy. "Was there treasure?" Jenna forced a smile, her heart aching with the enormity of what she couldn't tell him. "Just some old bank records, sweetie. Very, very old." She turned to Arthur, pulling her wallet from her back pocket. "Mr. Finch, I owe you the balance." She handed him the cash, her hands still shaking. He took it and, in return, gave her a formal invoice from a pad in his truck. It was meticulously filled out. For services rendered, 1 Victor safe drill and scope, property of Aurelia Courthouse. It was dated and signed in a clear, strong hand. Another piece of evidence. "Ms. Lawson," he said, his expression serious as he pocketed the money. "A piece of free advice. You're holding a lightning rod. Be careful who you tell, and be even more careful who you trust. People change when a number like that gets whispered in the wind." "I know," she said softly. "Thank you, Mr. Finch, for everything." He gave a single, decisive nod, gathered his tools, and walked out of the courthouse without a backward glance, his footsteps echoing in the vast, silent room. Jenna watched him go, then took Leo's hand, her grip a little too tight. "Come on, kiddo. Time to go home." As they walked out into the cool evening air, the weight of the secret she was leaving behind felt heavier than the iron safe itself. The drive back to the city was a silent, surreal journey through a world that no longer looked the same. The streetlights, the other cars, the glowing windows of houses, all seemed like props in a play that had nothing to do with her. Her reality was now a dark, hidden room in a ghost town. Her cramped apartment, when they finally arrived, felt both like a sanctuary and a cage. The stack of red-inked bills on her table seemed absurd, meaningless. After she put a very confused Leo to bed, assuring him they would go back to their castle soon, Jenna sat at her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She couldn't call the police. This wasn't a typical crime. This was a matter for the county, a complex issue of property and historical assets. Her paralegal instincts guided her to the official Sterling County website, a place she knew well. She found the contact page for the county treasurer's office. Taking a deep breath, She composed an email, choosing her words with the precision of a bomb disposal expert. To the office of the Sterling County Treasurer, she wrote. My name is Jenna Lawson. I am the legal owner of the property located at Lot 34, Aurelia, formerly the Aurelia County Courthouse. During a structural assessment of the building, I discovered a sealed safe, which I had professionally opened on this date by a bonded technician. The process was fully documented. The contents appear to be historical county assets, specifically sealed bank deposits from the defunct Aurelia County Bank and Trust. I am writing to arrange for a formal inventory and transfer of these assets to the county's possession. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to coordinate. She read it over a dozen times, then, with a click, sent it into the digital ether. The silence that followed was deafening. She had lit the fuse. Now all she could do was wait for the explosion. The next 2 days were a special kind of torment. Jenna went to work, her body moving through the motions of her job, while her mind replayed the opening of the safe, the sight of the canvas sacks, the scent of old money. Every conversation was a minefield, every interaction a performance of normalcy. She felt disconnected from her own life, a ghost haunting the edges of her daily routine. She jumped every time her phone buzzed. The call came on Tuesday afternoon. It was a man named George Carmichael, the Sterling County Chief Deputy Treasurer. His voice was dry, bureaucratic, and dripping with suspicion. Ms. Lawson, I'm returning your email regarding the Aurelia property, he said, his tone suggesting he was dealing with a crank. You claim to have found some assets? Jenna's resolve hardened. She would not be dismissed. Mr. Carmichael, yes. As I stated in my email, I have recovered a significant number of sealed deposit bags from a safe within the courthouse. I have a video record of the safe being opened by a bonded technician, Arthur Finch, who can serve as a witness. I need to schedule a time for you or your representatives to take possession of the items. The mention of a bonded witness and a video recording shifted the tone. There was a pause. I see, Carmichael said. The suspicion in his voice now mingled with a reluctant curiosity. This is a highly irregular situation, Ms. Lawson. I'm aware of that, Jenna replied coolly, which is why I am trying to handle it with the utmost regularity. When can you be there? They arranged to meet at the courthouse that Friday. The days leading up to it were a blur of anxiety. When Friday morning arrived, Jenna drove out to Aurelia with a knot of dread and anticipation in her stomach. She left Leo with a neighbor, telling him she had to meet some building inspectors at the courthouse. 2 county vehicles were already parked by the dead oak tree when she arrived. George Carmichael was a man in a rumpled suit who looked deeply unhappy to be out of his air-conditioned office. With him was a younger, sharper-looking woman he introduced as Maria Flores from the county council's office, and 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies who stood by, looking bored. Ms. Lawson, Carmichael said, forgoing a handshake. Let's see what this is all about. Jenna led them inside, the air thick with their collective skepticism. She didn't speak, letting the silent, dusty grandeur of the courtroom make its own impression. She led them to the judge's bench, her heart pounding. With a deep breath, she pushed on the carved panel. The hidden door swung open with a soft click. Carmichael and Flores exchanged a look of genuine surprise. They followed her into the cramped, musty room. Jenna aimed her flashlight at the safe. The technician had to drill the lock, she explained, pointing to the small, neat hole. The door is not locked. One of the deputies pulled the heavy door open. Jenna shone her light inside. The reaction was instantaneous and profound. The 4 officials stared, utterly speechless. The mountain of canvas sacks, silent and potent, filled the dark space. Maria Flores, the lawyer, was the first to recover. She took out her phone and took a picture, the flash a sudden, stark violation of the gloom. My God, Carmichael breathed, his bureaucratic bluster completely gone. The next few hours were a whirlwind of official procedure. The deputies brought in evidence containers and logging sheets. Maria Flores, her lawyer's mind clearly working at high speed, supervised the process. Each bag was removed, assigned an evidence number, and its seal was inspected and verified as intact before being placed in a secure container. Jenna stood by, watching, her own phone recording the entire inventory process. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a movie. When the last bag was sealed away, Maria Flores turned to Jenna. Her expression was no longer skeptical, but one of deep, professional respect. "Ms. Lawson, you have handled this with exemplary integrity," she said. "The county is in your debt." She handed Jenna a carbon copy of the evidence log, a formal receipt for the 93 bags recovered from the property. "We will be in touch." Then they were gone. The deputies loaded the containers into their vehicles and drove away, leaving Jenna alone once more in the silent courthouse. The hidden room was now empty. The safe stood open, a dark, hollowed-out shell. The secret was out. A strange sense of lightness filled her, the lifting of an immense burden. Weeks turned into a month. The story, as Arthur Finch had predicted, eventually leaked. The local paper ran a headline, "Ghost Town Gold Rush, Century-Old Fortune Found in Courthouse Vault." The official count was announced, $5,927,000. The money, as Jenna had suspected, was the sum total of Judge Blackwood's reign of terror, the stolen bonds and deposits from the 1890s. The discovery of the ledgers, combined with the cash, was irrefutable proof of the largest corruption scandal in the county's history. The county council's office, led by Maria Flores, was faced with an unprecedented legal dilemma. The money did not belong to the county. It belonged to the descendants of the miners and merchants Blackwood had defrauded, but tracing them after more than a century was a legal and genealogical impossibility. After weeks of research, Flores proposed a solution, one that was both legally sound and poetically just. The money would be used to establish the Aurelia Historical Trust. And then came the matter of Jenna Lawson. Under state law, as the finder of abandoned property who had followed all legal protocols, she was entitled to a finder's fee. Given the historical significance and the impeccable way she had conducted herself, Maria Flores argued successfully before a judge that Jenna's fee should be substantial. Jenna was at work when the call came. It was Maria. "The judge has signed off on the disbursement," she said, a smile in her voice. "The county will be wiring you your fee. It's 10% of the total recovery after administrative costs. $590,000. We've also approved a $1.5 million grant from the trust for the complete restoration of the Aurelia Courthouse, with the stipulation that it be used for a public service purpose." Jenna sank into her office chair, the phone slipping in her sweaty palm. $590,000. The number was meaningless, impossible. It was freedom. It was the end of debt. It was law school. It was a future for Leo she could never have dreamed of providing. Tears streamed down her face, silent tears of shock, relief, and a profound, bone-deep gratitude. 2 years later, the Aurelia Courthouse was no longer a ruin. The granite walls had been cleaned, the mortar repointed. New, custom-milled windows, exact replicas of the originals, gleamed in the sun. The great clock in the tower was ticking again, its hands showing the correct time, its deep, resonant chime marking the hours across the quiet hills. Inside, the transformation was even more profound. The courtroom was bright and clean, the wood polished to a warm glow. The dusty benches were gone, replaced by comfortable chairs and tables. Along one wall, a beautiful museum-quality exhibit detailed the story of the courthouse, of Judge Blackwood's corruption, and of the discovery that brought it to light. The centerpiece of the exhibit was the black iron safe, its door permanently open, a silent testament to the secrets it had kept. The rest of the space was now the Aurelia Community Law Center, a non-profit legal aid clinic. And at its head was Jenna Lawson, who had just passed the bar exam on her first try. She sat at a table, across from a young woman with a baby on her lap, a farm worker's wife who was being illegally evicted. Jenna listened patiently, her voice calm and reassuring, as she explained the woman's rights. Leo, now a lanky 12-year-old, was carefully archiving digital copies of the old court ledgers on a computer in the corner, his fascination with history now a focused passion. Jenna looked around the room, at the light streaming through the tall, arched windows, at the hopeful, determined face of her client. She had done more than just find a fortune. She had found her purpose. In this room, where justice had once been a commodity to be bought and sold, it was now a right, freely given to those who needed it most. The ghosts of Aurelia, the miners and merchants cheated by a corrupt judge, had finally found their advocate. The courthouse's story hadn't ended with the discovery of the money. It had just begun its most important chapter. And as the great clock in the tower chimed 4, Jenna smiled, a deep, genuine smile of a woman who was finally, truly, home.